Why did human reason evolve? For centuries, the answer seemed pretty obvious: to help us, as individuals, think better. But what if that's not its main purpose at all? Today, we're going to dig into a new theory that suggests the function of reason is actually all about our social world. Okay, so here's the plan. First, we're going to nail down what we even mean by a function in a biological sense. Then, we'll see how that traditional view of reason has been seriously challenged. After that, we'll take a look at the evolutionary psychology perspective, and finally, we'll unpack this new interactionist hypothesis, which comes with two core social functions: justification and argumentation. All right, so before we can even get to the function of reason, we have to get on the same page about what a function actually is, biologically speaking. It's a concept that sounds simple, but getting it right is absolutely crucial for the rest of the argument.
Let's start with something really simple, something man-made. When we ask about the function of this chair, the answer feels pretty obvious, right? For artifacts, things we make, the answer is easy. Its function is just what it was made for. And who decides that? The person who designed it. A chair is for sitting, simple as that. But trying to pin down the function of a biological trait is way less straightforward because, well, no one designed them.
Before Darwin, figuring out a biological function was basically just asking, what's it good for? Wings are for flying because flying is useful. But this common-sense approach couldn't answer the deeper question: why do biological traits have useful effects in the first place? For a long, long time, the only answer was a divine creator. Darwin's theory of natural selection completely changed the game, giving us the foundation for a scientific idea of function.
In an evolutionary context, a function is what we call a selected effect. So a trait that can be passed down has a bunch of different effects. But if one of those effects helps its carrier survive and reproduce more successfully, that trait is likely to get selected for and spread. Take a wildflower's scent, for example. It was selected because by attracting pollinators, it helped the plant reproduce. That beneficial effect is its function. And this leads us to the key idea of adaptations. These are traits that exist because of their useful functions. But, and this is super important to remember, not every single feature is an adaptation. The heart's ability to contract and pump blood is an adaptation, but the noise it makes while doing it, that's just an incidental side effect. Okay, so now that we have a solid grasp of what a function is in evolutionary terms, let's circle back to reason itself and see how this understanding really challenges the classic view. The traditional or intellectualist view has always been that the function of reason is obvious. It's a tool for individuals to get better information, make smarter choices, and that's what supposedly lifts us humans up above all the other animals. Even Darwin himself was on board with this idea. He put reason at the very top of human abilities and argued that our intellectual faculties would have been perfected through natural selection because, the most sagacious individuals would logically rear the most offspring. But this creates a pretty big puzzle. Darwin's claim is specific enough that we can test it scientifically. If reason evolved to help us think better, then it ought to perform that function well. Yet, decades of modern psychological research have uncovered major systematic flaws in the way humans reason. Now, you'd think this discovery would lead psychologists to question the assumed function of reason, but for a long time it didn't. Instead, many of them took these flaws as proof that an evolutionary approach to psychology was just irrelevant. They basically reasoned that if an evolved mechanism performs this badly, then maybe evolution isn't the right way to think about the human mind. This whole perspective started to shift in a big way back in the 1980s with the rise of evolutionary psychology. Researchers started asking, what if reason's poor performance isn't a flaw at all, but actually a clue to its real function? In a landmark paper from 1989, psychologist Lida Cosmides put forward two major claims. First, that we should expect our reasoning mechanisms to be specialized tools for solving specific, recurring problems from our ancestral past. And second, that one of these special tools is a module specifically for solving a huge problem in cooperation, detecting cheaters. This sparked a huge debate. If the mind is made up of all these specialized modules, what does that mean for reason, which we traditionally think of as this broad, all-purpose faculty? It seemed like there were only two possibilities. Either the human mind isn't fully modular, or the kind of reasoning we've always talked about doesn't actually exist. But there is a third way to think about it. What if reason is a specialized module, but one that deals with a very unique kind of thing, representations themselves? Its specific job is to handle the relationship between reasons and the conclusions they support. And since those reasons and conclusions can be about any topic, this module ends up having a kind of virtual all-purpose utility. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because this leads to what's called an interactionist hypothesis. This view completely rejects the old intellectualist idea that reason evolved for solitary thinking. Instead, it argues that reason evolved to solve problems we run into during social interaction. This interactionist approach says that reason has two main social functions. The first one, justification, helps us solve big problems of coordination. And the second one, argumentation, helps us solve big problems of communication. So let's dive into that first function. How does producing justifications help us humans navigate the incredibly complex challenge of social coordination? Human cooperation is just exceptional in its scale and flexibility. But this creativity means we have to be constantly updating our expectations of one another. The usual answers for how we manage this, things like shared social norms and mind reading, are definitely essential, but they aren't enough to achieve the really fine-tuned coordination our daily lives demand. The missing piece of the puzzle is the constant, interactive process of justification. We are always explaining ourselves. By giving reasons, we influence how people judge us, we commit ourselves to acting a certain way in the future, and we help create the shared expectations we all need to coordinate our lives. Essentially, justifications are like a bridge. They connect our internal mental states to the external social norms. We frame our personal motivations as being consistent with those norms, and we present those norms as having a real influence on us. We're kind of normalizing our own psychology and psychologizing the norms to protect our reputation and work together effectively. All right, let's move on to the second function and see how argumentation helps us solve a fundamental problem that comes with communication. Human communication is so much more complex than what other animals do, but it presents a real dilemma. If you're a speaker, you don't just want to be understood, you want to be believed and have influence. But if you're a listener, you're at risk of being manipulated by misinformation. If we just automatically trusted everything we heard, it would be an absolute disaster. The philosopher Thomas Reid suggested that nature solved this with two built-in principles: a tendency for us to speak the truth and a tendency for us to trust others. An all-powerful creator might design us this way, but natural selection is a lot less likely to create such perfect harmony. It would probably favor communicators who deceive when it helps them and receivers who are not easily fooled. So instead, it seems we evolved a whole toolkit of cognitive mechanisms for what's called epistemic vigilance. This is basically our mental filter, constantly adjusting our trust by checking out both the source of information, who to believe, and its content, what to believe. Now, this vigilance is essential, but it does create a bottleneck for information. Sometimes we might reject good information because we don't fully trust the source. This is where argumentation comes in. It helps genuine information get past that bottleneck by allowing a speaker to convince an audience that is cautious, but still open-minded. This puzzle is a brilliant way to see how argumentation works. Is it just likely, or is it certain that two farmers have the same number of cows? Instead of just giving the answer, a good argument walks you through the logic. You imagine the farmers getting into groups based on their cow count. You realize there can be, at most, 17 groups. With 22 farmers to fit into those 17 groups, it suddenly becomes obvious that at least one group must have more than one farmer. The argument lets the listener see the coherence for themselves, making it way more convincing than just stating a fact. So if justification and argumentation are the main functions of reason, what about individual thinking? Could it be a secondary function? To think about this, consider the sea turtle. Its flippers are exquisitely adapted for swimming, but females also use them, pretty clumsily, to dig nests on land, a behavior that is clearly good for reproduction. But is digging a secondary function of their flippers? To argue that, you'd need to find features of the flippers that are specifically adapted for digging. If you can't, it's probably best to call it a beneficial side effect. We can ask the same question about reason. Is solitary, inquisitive thinking a secondary function, or just a useful side effect of a tool that really evolved for social interaction? Ultimately, this interactionist approach paints a whole new picture of reason. What evolved wasn't some all-powerful tool for individual enlightenment, but a more modest, specialized module. It's an intuitive mechanism built to produce and evaluate reasons, mostly to serve two critical social functions: justifying ourselves to coordinate with others, and arguing with them to communicate more effectively.